So, earthquakes are one manifestation of the geophysical transformations of the planet as convection currents of heat, or possibly other forces, propel the various tectonic plates constituting the Earth's surface. The movement and collisions of these plates results in the accumulation of strain, and when the strain resolves quickly, for example, when two plates locked by friction suddenly slip past each other, or when one that's been pulled down by another suddenly rebounds upward, seismic waves move through the Earth, causing it to shake. This natural process constitutes a hazard vis-a-vis the built environment of human civilizations. Natural disasters occur when seismic or other hazards impinge on human societies. Just as historians have studied societies through the lens of disasters such as warfare or epidemic disease, earthquakes offer useful and distinctive windows into societies. If one task of historians is to seek out and leverage the widest variety of possible perspectives, earthquakes can serve as useful tools. Let's see if I can do this. Yes. And I apologize for kind of like, this promoting my own work a lot on this. Between approximately 2005 and 2015, the main topic of my research was the history of earthquakes in Japan. Subtopics included artistic and literary products of earthquakes, let me see here, impacts of earthquakes on economic and political history, the intersection of earthquakes and mass media during the 19th century, the ways that major earthquakes shaped the development of seismology during the 19th and 20th centuries, the ways earthquakes shaped public policy in the modern era, and the evolution of popular understandings of earthquakes. I came to the topic by chance, and my first specific interest was the catfish prints, Namazue, produced in the wake of the 1855 Ansei Edo earthquake. This topic was accessible in the sense that the sources were readily available. With catfish prints as the entry point, I gradually expanded my horizons. My methodology was conventional. On the one hand, I began to familiarize myself with the basic concepts of contemporary seismology, and on the other, I worked through the massive primary and secondary literature on Japanese earthquakes. Although not rigidly systematic, I typically worked through the major events of the early modern era, one earthquake at a time. This process culminated in the Ansei Edo earthquake, 1855, which produced more literature than any previous earthquake had, and which became the focus of the book Seismic Japan. The Ansei Edo earthquake, however, cast a long shadow over subsequent seismic events, so I continued the process, researching such topics as the Sanriku tsunamis of 1896 and 1933, the academic debates about the causes of tsunamis that became particularly intense around the turn of the 20th century, the period of relative seismic calm between the late 1940s and 1995, and the relative optimism during that era regarding the ability of science to predict earthquakes. This research resulted in a second book, When the Earth Roars. Today, I will briefly discuss sources, mention a few of my findings, and suggest possible directions for future research. Sources. Located at the intersections of 3 or possibly 4 tectonic plates, the Japanese islands have been seismically active long before historical times. Ancient and medieval texts often mention earthquakes, but details are sparse prior to the 1580s, or at least so I think. We might hear more on that. From the 17th century onward, the documentation for major earthquakes expands dramatically compared with previous eras. For example, the Kambun earthquake of 1662 produced extensive records of damage and a major work of earthquake fiction, Asai Yoi's Foundation Stone, or Kaname Ishi. Foundation Stone, written in the guise of on-the-scene reporting, became a template for much subsequent earthquake-inspired popular literature. Thanks to the efforts of seismologists, historians, and others, the availability of published earthquake-related sources has grown steadily throughout the 20th century. Similarly, Early modern and modern sources have become increasingly available in digital form over the past 2 decades. The most important collections of published primary sources are, we've already heard about this a little bit. First, Dai Nihon Jishin Shiryo. This was inspired by the 1891 Nobi earthquake. The first iteration was published in 1904 in 2 volumes with Tayama Minoru as editor. Seismologist Musha Kinkichi added over 6,000 documents to the collection and published a revised edition in 3 volumes between 1941 and 1943, and a single volume, Nihon Jishin Shiro, in 1951. Usami Tatsuo published revised versions of these collections in 1998. So that's the first. And then second, the successor to Dai Nihon Jishin Shiryo is Shinshu Nihon Jishin Shiryo, compiled by the Earthquake Research Institute, sometimes known as ERI, the University of Tokyo, in multiple volumes between 1891 and 1994. I realize the type is too small for you to see, but you just see that's how many volumes there are. Massive, and these are very substantial volumes. So there's a lot out there, and that's just the beginning. Third, Usami Tatsuo has continued to edit supplementary volumes of documents under the title Nihon no Rekishi Jishin Shiryo Shui, and there are several other focused compilations of primary sources, but nearly all of them are subsets of these larger compilations. While researching both books, I made extensive use of digital archives and other web-based resources. A sample of these resources includes databases of the Earthquake Research Institute, the ERI, University of Tokyo, and the Tsunami Digital Library. So there's 2 examples here. Particularly useful for anyone researching earthquakes prior to 1607 is the Ancient and Medieval Earthquake and Volcanic Eruption Sources database. Moreover, the National Diet Library, major university libraries, especially Waseda, and other libraries throughout Japan also provide extensive digitalized primary sources, particularly like Waseda. And most of these you can just get them right from the web. You don't have to go through any particular procedure. Most scientific papers from the late 19th century onward are available as PDF files in repositories such as JStage. If you know the exact title, you can probably get it right from your computer. Organizations, government agencies, and academic societies are excellent resources for research. Examples include the Society of Historical Earthquake Studies, whose journal is available to the public, Chuo Bosai Kaigi, or in English it's called the Central Disaster Management Council, which provides access to a wide variety of sources, such as detailed academic studies of each major earthquake, and the U.S. Geological Survey. And of course, we have just heard a presentation about some of the latest digital tools for earthquake research. In general, there's no shortage of primary and secondary sources. But because they are so widely dispersed and many are still available only on paper, historical earthquake research requires much time and energy spent searching, shifting, and filtering. And let me just pause for Susan's question earlier. For a document to appear in these collections, it just has to have the word jishin in it, or some variation of furu, to shake, or anything. And often there's no description of what kind of document it is. So you kind of read this thing and wonder what that is. It looks like it may be a record of, from some stable keeper of certain horses, or just anything at all. So you really have to be filtering for these things. And so anyway, going forward, researchers will benefit from continued efforts to digitalize sources, and a website listing or pulling together all major sources, archives, and databases would be helpful. And we've got so much stuff out there. More is still better, but also getting it organized would really help. That's what I'm trying to say. All right, so shifting from sources now to a little bit about findings. I will now mention a few of the findings that I discuss in one or the other of my books. First, by the 18th century, a general consensus on the mechanism of earthquakes had emerged. It was that yang energy trapped beneath the Earth's surface accumulates and seeks to escape upward. If the soil is very sandy or if there are very many wells, that's no problem, but if the soil contains clay or rocks, an explosion may occur. How does the yang energy get into the earth, which is normally the realm of yin? There's many mechanisms, but two of them are wind and rays of the sun. I need to get going here so I don't go over time. Because of this mechanism, people tend to associate unusually warm weather with earthquakes. In the early years of Meiji-era seismology, researchers devoted much attention to possible links between atmospheric phenomena and earthquakes. Indeed, the JMA is still in charge of many aspects of earthquakes. It's a legacy of that. As well as other aspects of early modern lore, such as flashes of light and the idea that fish can predict earthquakes. The vast accumulation of information about earthquakes became both a head start and a burden for the emerging science of seismology. The idea that earthquakes could be predicted also emerged in the 1820s, and the 1855 Ansei-Edo earthquake reinforced it. How? By cataloging apparent earthquake precursors, Zencho, which, despite the name, were always recognized retrospectively, and still are. With lists of precursors in mind, presumably people could be on the lookout for them in the future and know when an earthquake's about to occur. Significantly, the accumulation of data in a search for reliable precursors is still the main approach to earthquake prediction in Japan. Furthermore, although the fundamental theory of earthquakes is entirely different today because of plate tectonics, 19th century vintage precursors still make appearances in books about predicting earthquakes. I'm not going to run through them all just to save time, but we can talk about them later if you're interested. And despite a long, there's an example of some anti-seismic engineering, which I'll talk about right now. Despite a long interest in the topic of earthquake prediction, the success rate in Japan for earthquake prediction has been approximately 0, which is on a par with the rest of the world. By contrast, however, Japan has led the world in applications of anti-seismic engineering. Although often attributed, probably incorrectly, to temple architecture, explicitly anti-seismic building ideas emerged in the wake of the Ansei-Edo earthquake, such as you see here. This event caused a modification in the prevailing theory of earthquakes, such that the idea was that a buildup of electricity under the ground replaced the yang energy to create the explosion. And so the plans for massive underground lightning rods, as you see on the left, or chains set deep into wells to protect buildings, they never actually took place, but the idea of engineering the built environment that could withstand earth seismicity was in place by the 1850s, and it began to pay dividends in the 1880s and 90s, and continues to do so. I'm just going to, the next and last topic is going forward. And I want to mention that a lot of the book, well, in English especially, what you typically get are books about specific earthquakes, all right? So like, for example, Gregory Clancy's book, Earthquake Nation, about the Novi earthquake, or Charles Schenking's book about the Great Kanto earthquake. And there's probably room for at least a little more of that, and I was going to suggest the 1847 Zenkoji earthquake is a good candidate. This deadly event was very well documented. It took place within a complex physical and geographical geography, and although the Ansei-Edo earthquake only shook the shogun's capital, and thus, in some sense, simplified the politics of it, the Zenkoji earthquake required the coordination of several daimyo domains. Other possibilities for further research include, and this will be my last point, is biographies of individual seismologists, or groups of them, or, much more ambitious, a history of seismology that's truly global in scope, that takes into account Japan, China, and other places outside of Europe. So I will end at this point, and we can talk about more things later.